Iran Chat is brought to you by the American Iranian Council, pioneering the marketplace of ideas since 1997. Welcome to Iran Chat. I'm Kayvon Afshari in Washington, D.C. Our guest today is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and served until 2013 as a senior member of the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiating team. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Robert Einhorn. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kayvon.
So, Mr. Einhorn, Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which outlines its rights and obligations as a non-weapons state. Would you say that these current P5+1 negotiations are taking place within or outside of that NPT framework?
Well, obviously, the objective of the talks is to ensure that Iran is a member of the NPT in good standing, in full compliance with its obligations. The U.S. and the other countries of the P5+1 group believe that certainly in the past, Iran was not in compliance with all of its nuclear non-proliferation obligations. So the objective of the talks is to restore confidence that Iran is complying with all of its NPT obligations.
Mm-hmm. So it's based on Iran's past behavior that has led to these talks, which has now gone beyond the NPT framework, essentially.
Yes, and I think to satisfy concerns about its past behavior, Iran will have to accept certain restrictions and certain monitoring measures by the International Atomic Energy Agency so as to restore confidence in the peaceful intention of its nuclear program.
One of the proposals on the negotiating table is for Iran to ship its stockpiles of uranium to Russia for conversion to fuel rods. And there are some rumors and members of the Iranian parliament claiming that the Iranian negotiators are entertaining this idea or may be convinced that it's necessary to achieve a deal. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, clearly this question has been discussed, and what I hear is that there is a tentative understanding that this will be a part of an overall comprehensive deal, that much, if not most, of Iran's low-enriched uranium will be shipped to Russia to be converted into fuel rods for the Bushehr reactor. Conservatives in Iran have criticized the negotiating team for supposedly agreeing to do this. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the negotiators themselves, have said there's no agreement on this. I think both are correct. I think a tentative understanding has been reached through conversations, but in this negotiation, nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. So there is no formal agreement. So I think when Iranian spokespersons say there's no agreement on this, they're being accurate. There is no agreement on this, but I think the expectation of those who have participated in the talks is that this will be part of a final deal.
Iranian parliament, members of parliament have suggested that U.S. negotiators are demanding that Iran's missiles be put on the table. Has that ever been a position of the U.S. nuclear negotiating team?
Well, it's a position that comes from UN Security Council resolutions that have been adopted with Russian and Chinese support and that mandate under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter that Iran not pursue certain missile-related activities, including flight testing, procurement of technology for missiles. The concern was that if Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons, then there should be constraints on the delivery systems that could send these nuclear weapons to their targets. So it's derived from the Security Council resolutions. Now, how this gets worked out in the nuclear talks, I'm not sure. Iran takes the view that missiles are off the table because they have to do with Iran's conventional defense capability. They have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. The U.S. and some of its partners are concerned that this missile delivery capability would become very worrisome, especially if there are doubts about Iran's nuclear intentions. So the U.S. would like to see some constraints. How this will work out, I don't know. I have suggested that the nuclear deal itself not address missiles, but that separately the U.S. and some others urge Iran to accept some voluntary constraints on its missile testing activity.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's a push for new sanctions. The Menendez-Kirk bill calls for such. What are your thoughts on this bill?
Well,
in terms of how it'll affect the negotiations.
Right. I think it is true that existing sanctions have played an important role in giving Iran incentives to come to the negotiating table and to negotiate very seriously. I think they've had that beneficial effect. Mm-hmm. But at this stage, I don't believe that new sanctions are necessary. They're not necessary because the existing sanctions are still having an important impact on Iran's economy. The sanctions that have been suspended are relatively minor, but all of the banking and oil sanctions remain in place, and they're hurting the Iranian economy. Plus, the sharp drop in the price of oil is further exacerbating the impact of the sanctions on Iran's economy. So I don't think there's a need for additional sanctions at this stage. Plus, the imposition of new sanctions by the Congress, I think, would have a very negative impact on the negotiations. Mm-hmm. The Iranians have claimed that in the event of new sanctions, that this would lead to a discontinuation of the talks. I don't know whether or not Iran would actually walk out of the talks as a result of a new congressional sanctions law, but I think it's risky to test that proposition. And I think from a Western perspective, if the U.S. Congress imposed new sanctions, the world would draw the conclusion that it's the U.S. that doesn't want an agreement, that the U.S. is being intransigent. And I think...
so it would send the wrong message to the world.
It would send the wrong message, but it would have the opposite effect of what the proponents of new sanctions would like to see. Instead of putting additional pressure on Iran, it would alleviate pressure, mm-hmm. Because I think Iran would go to world public opinion and say, look who's raising problems for these negotiations. And it could lead to a fragmentation of the coalition of countries that have imposed sanctions on Iran. So sanctions could end up being weakened rather than strengthened by such action.
Do you think that some of those pushing for new sanctions are doing so with the intention of extracting more concessions from Iran, or perhaps as a move to sabotage these negotiations?
Well, everyone who supports the Kirk-Menendez bill says we favor this because it will give us more leverage to achieve a good agreement. Mm-hmm. So we're only doing this to support administration efforts to get an agreement. Now, of all the people who are saying that, I suspect that some fraction of them really are trying to derail the negotiations, to undermine them, to kill them altogether. These are people who really don't want an agreement. I think, though, that a substantial number of senators and members of the House of Representatives who support new sanctions do so because they genuinely believe it would have a positive effect on moving Iran to the kind of position that could make an agreement possible.
While talking about the sanctions and the economy, you brought up the issue of oil, too, which is now just below $50 a barrel. Iran's economy is, of course, very reliant on oil. So is this going to make the negotiations more successful or less likely to be successful?
It's hard to predict. I think those Iranians who have a realistic perspective on what's needed to make Iran's economy work better will understand that the drop in the price of oil further exacerbates Iran's economic dilemma. And they will see this as another reason to show the flexibility in the talks that can get to an agreement, that can get the sanctions lifted. But the Supreme Leader talks about an economy of resistance. He talks about relying not on foreigners, but on Iran's domestic resources to essentially be autonomous and not be dependent on the world economy. And from that perspective, the drop in the price of oil is yet another reason to go for an economy of resistance. So it's not clear what impact this is going to have, but I think realistic Iranians, sensible Iranian economists understand that this is another reason why Iran should be trying to find a compromise agreement.
What do you think, I guess first, do you think that these negotiations are likely to be successful? We have two extensions now. The next goal is to have, this framework for a deal by March and then a comprehensive deal on the nuclear issue by June. Do you want to make a prediction on that?
Well, I'll make a prediction about March.
Okay.
I think it's going to be very difficult to have an entire political framework worked out by March. Now, what is critical is to break through on two or three issues. The question of enrichment capacity, the question of duration of an agreement, and the question of the phasing and timing of sanctions relief. Those are the key issues. There are other important issues that you would need to have a full political framework, but I think if they achieve those things by March, that would be a major accomplishment and would give them some prospect of being able to finalize the deal by the end of June.
And let's say if they were unable, for some reason, to achieve this deal, where do U.S.-Iran relations go after that?
Well, it depends on what happens at the end of June. Right now, negotiators on the Iranian side, on the American side, don't want to talk about that eventuality. What they're saying is we're committed to getting a deal, a final deal by the end of June. But if we remember correctly, they were saying the same thing, toward the end of last July, and then toward the November 24th. And yet they accepted essentially a rollover of the interim arrangements. If they got to the end of June and they still had significant differences that needed to be worked out, they would have to make a decision. Do we want to end the talks here, or do we want to roll this over once again? I think that would be a hard choice because neither in Tehran nor in Washington do people want to see this negotiation continue indefinitely. But I think the risks and the costs of stopping negotiations altogether would likely move them to a decision to continue the talks further.
Mr. Einhorn, thank you so much for taking the time for this interview. We do appreciate it.
Kayvon, my pleasure.
Thank you. This has been Iran Chat. I'm Kayvon Afshari in Washington, D.C. For more, visit American-Iranian.org.